We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 198 for September 23rd, 2020. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about the RPA. Is it useful or is it useless? So go fill out your RPA application or start an entirely new organization. It's really up to you because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Heather in California.
Hi, everyone.
And Stephen in Calgary.
Hello.
All right, so just the three of us today, and I thought I would bring up a topic that just keeps floating to the top on Facebook particularly. And it was a post put up by somebody, I don't know, probably weeks ago, if not months ago, but somebody comments on it every once in a while, and Facebook algorithm floats it right back to the top of the list. And I think it's in the Archaeo Field Techs group. It might be on this guy's personal page. I don't think so. I think it's in Archaeo Field Techs. I'm also recording from my car in front of a McDonald's in Elko, Nevada. I don't know if you just heard the beep, but my car's complaining and wants to shut off because it's been running for too long. But it's hot, and I'm leaving the AC on, so you might hear some noises. Anyway, this post is about RPA. And if you don't know what that is, it's the Register of Professional Archaeologists. And recently they announced, I guess last year they announced that this year they were putting into effect the new RA, which is Registered Archaeologist. What the RA is supposed to do is bring in all the other people that have been complaining that they've been excluding from being an RPA, right? So basically everyone without a graduate degree. Because to be a registered professional archaeologist, and this isn't, quote, registered professional archaeologist, this is to be in the organization that is the RPA, is you had to have a graduate degree, right? And you had to have completed a thesis or seen a project through to completion from research design to report. And that's an interesting point on that, because you can have a graduate degree without doing a thesis, because there are non-thesis graduate degree programs where you can get a master's degree. Mm-hmm. But if you have been running project as like a project manager, you do the proposal, you see the project through, you write the report at the end, that counts, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a thesis. At least it used to count. I don't know if it still does. But anyway, this post basically says that RPA is a scam. It doesn't do anything. They lie by saying that RPA is required on some jobs, and they list these things, and then he's researched them and then found out that, turns out, no, they don't list those as requirements. I'm not really sure what to say about that. Maybe it did in the past. The RPA is run by volunteers, so that's not an excuse, but I'm willing to bet the website is also run by volunteers. It's probably not kept up to snuff. But I just want to know what you guys think about RPA. I belong to the RPA. I have since I got my graduate degree. I think that first year I went ahead and did it because I saw them at a conference, and that first year after you get your degree, it's like $35 or something like that or whatever. Heather and Stephen. Heather, are you RPA?
I am.
Stephen, are you RPA as well?
Yes, I am.
All right. So we're all three of us RPA. So that's the perspective we're coming in from. So go ahead, Heather.
So, I think it depends on the area that you're in as far as how important being an RPA is. I've had friends across the country that work as professional archaeologists, and RPA does not hold the same status or requirement. Well, the requirement for the RPA is the same across the board, but agencies don't require it in some areas, but they do in others. So for that article to say that it's not required at all is not true. Because I can give you multiple agencies, at least in the California area, that in order to even be on their list of consultants that developers or applicants are, looking for an archaeologist, when they're given the requirement to have a survey or whatever study, they have to choose from the list of qualified consultants that agency has. And many, if not most, of those agencies require in California for the archaeologist, or at least the lead archaeologist, to have RPA, to be RPA. Mm-hmm. So I don't know where don't know where this person lives, and perhaps in that area it's not required. But, that's a strong word. I understand this is probably an opinion piece. I've read it. Yeah, obviously it's an opinion piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To call it a scam is not fair. It's just, there's always going to be good and bad aspects of those kind of registries. And there's always going to be people that are going to fall through the cracks. And which is, like, as you said, why the RA was created. I think the fee is nominal. I think most companies are paying. I know my company pays for my RPA, so I haven't paid for it myself in many, many years. And for those that we're having register as an RA, we're paying for that as well. So, even then it's a nominal fee. So I don't know. I'll let Steve chime in, but to call something a scam is, not appropriate, in my opinion.
Right. Stephen.
I've been a member since, I think, 2007, and I have never, ever needed it for work. In a lot of ways, I think it serves as a shorthand for, yes, I'm Secretary of Interior qualified, because you basically have to be Secretary of Interior qualified to be RPA. And so someone can look at it and be like, like the question doesn't come up where they have to like go down the checklist of my CV and compare it against the interior qualifications of professional archaeologist. So in that respect, I can imagine where it might be somewhat useful, nominally useful, because, people can be like, he made it onto the register, therefore he's Secretary of Interior qualified. I will say that back in my old job, when I used to hire people, occasionally I did come across people who would put down RPA, but then not actually be a member of the RPA. Maybe they had been, they let it lapse. I don't know.
Right.
But like it was on their CV, but if you went to the RPA directory, they weren't listed at all. So if you hire and that has any sort of bearing to your hiring decision, you might want to double check. So I don't think it's a scam. I don't think it's super useful. Like I say, I've never had a job where it was necessary. And I don't know that I've ever seen a job that I was trying to get where it was necessary. So like that might just be a California thing. I don't know.
Stephen, where have you worked? I know obviously you're in Calgary now, but what areas of the U.S.?
Mostly the Western Great Lakes.
Okay.
A little bit in the Southeast, but
okay. Yeah, I will say that almost every job opening that I see in California for a higher level position, RPA is listed.
Is that for like a contract, like a gig, or is that from like a CRM firm hiring?
A CRM firm hiring. And I will say, we have Caltrans, which is, our transportation entity out here, which has, their own forms, their own, writing templates, some, very strict requirements. And, not only do we have to be RPA, but you have to have a full list. You have to, in fact, just recently I had to fill out a whole questionnaire of all of my experience aside from the resume and CV. I don't know. I think it's a really good point that you're making about people needing to make sure that they check the RPA, because I have definitely found that. I think it's probably an honest mistake that somebody just let it lapse. I would hate to think that somebody is actually saying their RPA when they never were registered.
Well, especially if they're applying for a job that doesn't need it.
Right.
And that's just it. It's like for the positions I was hiring for, absolutely not required. Like a field school was required. That was the requirement. So putting it on there when it didn't matter really didn't do much.
So, Stephen, you mentioned its usefulness, like the RPA's usefulness, right? And that was in the context of, for your particular situation, that was in the context of you never needed it to get a job, that you could tell, so it didn't seem useful. And the usefulness of the RPA has been one of the most brought up things anytime somebody talks about RPA that I've seen on multiple Facebook posts, not just the one that we were talking about. But everybody always says, oh, it's useless. What does it do? Blah, blah, blah. And I guess, yeah, it probably seems like that. Like they are a little bit useless because they haven't directly affected you. And I'm using the royal you, like everybody. I guess the way I see the RPA is we need some sort of professional organization and recognition just to, I guess, give us a little more bargaining power with other clients and professions. You know what I mean? Like when you put RPA after your name versus not putting RPA after your name, when you're talking with a client, that does actually mean something. They don't know what it means, but they see extra letters after your name. And unfortunately, in this world, that does actually mean something, right?
The problem with that is that for a lot of the people who have other initials behind their name, there is some sort of legal standing that supports it. So like in Alberta, and this is where it gets weird, because like in Alberta, there are things like professional foresters and professional project managers and stuff like that. And they're essentially licensed by the province. I'm not licensed to be RPA. There's no license involved. And right. So it puts me kind of in a weird spot where in some ways it almost feels like I'm duping the client to think that we're something we're not.
Well, I think, here to me, that's apples and oranges, because when you have a project manager, when you become yes, you can do have an MA in project management, but generally the way we educate ourselves as archaeologists is through university. So when you have a project manager, you have some of these licensing professions are done through a series of workshops and a series of continuing education outside of university. And so the licensing is to show that you have one area that is compiled this one person's experience, workshops, continuing education. They have met this threshold of this much work or this much experience and education, which gives them the ability to be licensed. Where with archaeologists, we've already gone through, how many years of grad school, which, RPA, you do, like Chris said, need to, except some very, very small exceptions, you have to have an MA. So you've already gone through, your education is front loaded. And so I do think that there's a difference here. What I would like to see, though, is that to have somebody who's a registered professional archaeologist, to me, I think the perception from a client is that this person, just like any other kind of licensed profession, this person has continuing education. This person has developed themselves as a professional in the field. We all know that when somebody goes to the university and they have an MA in archaeology, they can know squat about CRM. But now all of a sudden they have an RPA, and it's to me, that's where the usefulness does start to wane a little bit in my eyes, because, RPA does not necessarily mean experience. And so it can be a little misleading from a client perspective. Now, if I'm hiring somebody and it says RPA, well, that's one thing, whatever, but I'm also going to look at your resume and I'm going to look at your experience. I'm going to call references and all that. But generally, clients don't do that. It's just kind of like this stamp, like an architect has a stamp, and they register and they have to keep that stamp up, or they can't, submit plans. I wish that there was more teeth to the RPA as far as the requirements go. That would be my issue.
Yeah. I'm looking at the requirements right now, and we'll probably end the section with this real quick, just so people know what we're talking about here. But one of the requirements for RPA is you have to submit your CV or resume. Applicants who have an advanced degree but attended a non-thesis program, like I was saying, or completed a thesis dissertation that does not include both archaeological research problem focus. So you could have done a thesis, but it just doesn't fit the requirements. You have to complete this section 4 of the application, but basically it's detailed documentation combination of 52 weeks of excavation, survey, and laboratory experience, including 20 weeks of supervisory research experience. Also submit up to 2 project reports that they authored that demonstrate problem focus and data analysis equivalent to that required for a thesis or dissertation. And then an RA has to have at least 2 years of supervised work experience, for example, a CV or resume listing dates, positions, and duties. And they're also required to be sponsored by an RPA. So I think we just have to manage expectations, right? Because I think a lot of people want the RPA to be something that it's not, but basically what it is it's saying you've completed these requirements right here. That's all you can say when somebody says they're RPA, is that they have completed these requirements. And going forward into 2021, I'll have to dig into it to find exactly where this is, but all members of the RPA from RA on up are going to have to do continuing education to maintain your RPA. Like you right now, you could have gone 20 years and just pay your dues every year and you're still an RPA, but you literally never did any archaeology since day one. And, you could be working at Old Navy right now and be an RPA and nobody cares, right? But you're going to have to do your continuing education to keep all that going. So I think we'll just go ahead and take a break right there, because I know we can just spark off hours of conversation from that comment. So let's take a break and then we'll come back and keep talking about this back in a second. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code CRMARC. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode. All right, welcome back to episode 198 of the CRM Archaeology Podcast, and we're talking about RPA right now. And I did want to mention some of the requirements, and another comment that's always mentioned is the cost of the RPA. And I want to just mention that real quick. So there's an initial first-year cost. Actually, for RAs, the first-year cost in 2020 has been waived, so you can actually get into it for free. And I don't think Heather's dog likes that at all.
I'm sorry.
Heather's dog is like, that is BS. I want to pay my dues right now.
Perfect timing, Lily.
I don't know what Ruckus thinks about this, Stephen, but I imagine just pure disgust. So,
well, he sleeps. So he finds it completely riveting.
I'm sure he does. So anyway, RPA has an interesting pricing structure. There's actually 3 prices for RPA. It's $55 for members that are also members of their sponsoring organizations. So the AIA, the AAA, the SHA, or the SAA. So if you're a member of one of those, you pay $55 a year. If you're not a member of one of those, but you're a member of another affiliated organization, like your local state society or something like that, got RPA affiliation. I don't know how they do that, but they can. Then it's $85 a year. If you're not affiliated with anything, it's $135 a year. Now, this is for RPA. And it does note here that I didn't know until I just read this. In 2021, the sponsored organization one is going from 55 to 75, and the affiliated society is going from 85 to 95. So for a lot of people, it's probably going to be the 85 or 135, unless you also belong to the SATA or SHA. Now, I go to the SHA and SA almost every year, so I belong to those, which means it's $55 a year for me usually. Now, the RA, $50, which is $5 less, but $50 for members of sponsoring organizations, the 4, $65 for members of affiliated societies, and $99 for people who are unaffiliated. And I'm willing to bet, just because a lot of techs don't tend to go to these conferences and things, some do, but I know when I was a tech, I went to very few just because you don't have the money for it, right? You can't get out of something and you just don't want to go. So it's probably going to be about $100. And in that case, some people might be saying, it's more expensive to be an RA than an RPA, because a lot of RPAs probably do go to conferences, right? Because they're in the position in their company where they're actually writing papers and presenting those papers at these conferences. So whether it's one of the big four or one of the affiliated societies, more than likely they're presenting something, or at least they have a more of an opportunity to present something, I should say, than say your field tech. So, and it also doesn't say that the RA prices are going up for those first two. So they might stay at 50, unless this is just a poorly placed note. I don't really know, but I'm thinking that's just for RPA, and RA will stay at 50. So it's actually going to be even better to be an RA from a cost standpoint. So anyway, there it is. It's not more expensive. And I feel like what the RPA does for us, or has the potential to do for us, like we really need to get more people in it. And what we need to get is more people in the governing body of the RPA, which has elections every year. But we need to get more people in the governing body of the RPA, because if you think the RPA is useless, well, damn it, get in there and do something about it, right?
Exactly.
Like we need to make it have some teeth. We don't have a licensing organization like you mentioned, Stephen, and we don't have, and we should have federal and state licensing. I mean, you need that to clip somebody's nails, but you don't need it to record somebody's heritage and history. So, we should have overall state licensing, but recognizing the fact that we don't, RPA is the best thing we have going for us right now. And that's kind of the place I go from is, yeah, it needs some work, but what else do we have?
Mm-hmm.
Well, to go back to something you just said about, well, if you don't like what it's doing or not doing, you should, run for the election, is that the problem is the big complaint about it not having licensure or teeth has nothing to do with the organization itself. Like, they can't just show up and be like, okay, we're going to be the licensing organization now. Like,
sure,
that's not how that works. Right? Like, that's actually like a governmental thing, and involves, I'm sure there's a huge legal process in how you make something that's, essentially open to anybody who meets a bare minimum of qualifications to, someone who's licensed. That, like, I'm sure there are, would be all sorts of legal challenges at the least.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if that's your complaint, if your complaint is, well, it's not actually a licensing organization, like, becoming president of the organization isn't going to change that, right?
I don't necessarily agree with that, though, because they have a lobbying position, right? And that is one of the things that they can be. They can be a voice for everybody. And if you get a president in there that says, I want to make a federal license for archaeologists, because I don't know if they'd have even power to do it at the state level. Laws aren't just made by government, right? Laws are made by people who propose them to government, and then it gets worked out. But somebody has to bring that forward first. And who better to do that than, or should do it, than the RPA? I know they haven't done it. You're right. You're totally right. But I'm not saying that doesn't mean they can't do it.
No, I think they have done it. I think they've done it repeatedly. And that was part of the whole, like, reboot from, what was it, SOPA? The precursor to RPA?
Yeah.
Part of that reboot was they were going to state governments and being like, hey, we need to make this, official. And the problem is that, like, governments aren't receptive to that sort of thing generally. Maybe they haven't done anything lately. I don't really know. I haven't been following that, but, like, that has been the organization's push in the past.
Right.
Well, I think maybe, I don't know, we should look at it apples to apples here. We have, what is our closest counterpart as far as compliance goes? You have biologists. Are they licensed?
I don't think so.
Right?
Well, they are here.
Okay. Geologists, I do not believe they're licensed, but you can get certain, I don't believe they're licensed, but you can get some, letters after your name after continuing education.
Sure.
I wish I knew more. I don't. So, we have to kind of look at it also. Why are we licensing where all the other compliance disciplines are not? And I'm not against the licensing idea. I just, we have to look at the reality of it. And if we have other compliance disciplines that aren't doing it, we have to see, why Why are we doing it? I don't think the licensing is an end all be all. There is another aspect to RPA, which, some people would argue also doesn't have teeth, but we don't know because for privacy reasons, we wouldn't know if people are have been complained against, right? So there's a process of turning somebody in who may not be working in an ethical manner, right? So I do know that is a part of RPA that's not going to be talked about, obviously, because of privacy issues. So there is one entity that people can come to if there's an issue. If a client has a problem or somebody witnesses some unethical behavior, there is an entity to speak to that is going to be somewhat neutral. So, if you have an archaeologist who's working for a company and they do something unethical, you would like to think that the company is going to do something about it, but maybe the reason they did something unethical, the company was behind it. Who knows? But, you have a neutral organization that somebody can come and report this kind of behavior. That is something that also I believe is useful when it comes to RPA. I don't know how often it happens.
I think that is useful, as you said, but then again, what is the penalty if you get an RPA violation or report against you and they find you, yes, you were being unethical, and they revoke your RPA and you can no longer put RPA past your name anymore? Like in certain circumstances, like you said, Heather, that will really hurt you in certain areas, right? But in this field, man, you can just move like 3 states away, bam, nobody knows you, and you can just keep on working, right?
True.
So,
yep.
Well,
and I actually
you don't even have to do that, right? Like you could just stop. You just stop putting the initials after your name, and eventually one of your friends will be like, "Hey, I noticed you're not putting the RPA after your initials anymore." It's like, yeah, I quit.
Right. Yeah, and it's doubtful anyone would even notice this. Yeah.
I mean, unless you're in an area like California where you're required, or you're working underneath somebody. So.
I don't know. I think I want to go back to what you were saying about licensing too, Heather, whether that wouldn't be the be all end all, but I want to know like how do you guys even see licensing? Like what would licensing even mean? What would a licensed archaeologist even do or mean? What would that look like? Because like I said, I've had to deal with a lot of stuff since we're putting our house up for rent. You've got licensed plumbers, licensed handymen. I see, license written on just about every service vehicle out there, except for archaeologists. And I'm trying to think like, okay, but what would a license actually do for archaeologists? What would that say? That would say that you've met certain educational requirements. That would say that you maybe passed a test or you just demonstrated ability through experience or something like that. But isn't that what the RPA application already does? Well, what else would a license get you?
You have a government, you have some government oversight, but we all know that doesn't mean much either.
Well, it does in some places. Like in Alberta, we use a permitting system where if I'm going to go off and run an archaeology project, I have to get a permit from the province in the same way that you have to on public lands. Like except this is for anything, private lands, public lands. If it's archaeology, it's the domain of the province. In Ontario, it's a licensing situation where the archaeologists aren't permitted by project, but they have an annual license, and you have to have an annual license to run an archaeological project. I'm not super deep on the details of this because I'm not licensed to work in Ontario. But I feel like this actually might be a fun topic to follow up on, and we can get some Ontario archaeologists on board. But they have a licensing process where you're licensed, which means you can do a project in that province. And if, you screw up or, don't get your reports in on time, which is, I believe it's at least a preliminary report by the end of the calendar year, then you don't get your license renewed. And if you don't get your license renewed, you can't run a project. If you can't run a project, your employability is greatly diminished. So it would be that sort of thing. And to the answer of like, well, that's just the application of the RPA. It's like, well, yeah, but that's because the RPA would be, if it were to become a licensing thing, it would be very weird in that you don't typically licensing for nurses, doctors, stuff like that. That's done by the state, right, in the U.S.
Right.
So
right.
I would think that the RPA might be able to, I don't know, do some sort of a shortcut as for the licensing process for an individual state. But like I don't know that it could be an overall licensing agency. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Yeah, I really like the idea of archaeologists not being able to have their license renewed if they're not completing projects on time or reports. I can't tell you how many times that they've done a full data recovery and you have not seen a report, or that report has not been turned into the information center. It's so frustrating. And now we've gotten to the point where we have, agencies, at least here in California that I work with, that part of the conditions of approval for a project, and before a project can get their full sign off, occupancy permit, whatever, they have to have proof that the report was turned in, and that if there was any data recovery, that curation has been completed. Because agencies are starting to realize that these reports are not being completed and it's not necessarily always the archaeologist, it's sometimes the client. Hey, I got what I needed. I've now even probably sold my property and I've developed, I made my money, and now I moved on. And the archaeologist doesn't get they don't get the funds. If they're not smart about it business-wise, they're not getting paid for the last bit of most important work, and that is completing the report and making sure artifacts are curated if that's what tribal groups want. So, I think that's really smart. We are now solving that with agencies requiring the timing before they sign off on the project as a whole. But I do see that as being a major issue, and I like that your license could be affected in that way. That would be probably, you would have to have such an infrastructure in order for the RPA to be able to do that.
Sure.
But I actually think it works this way, the way what I'm talking about with the agencies. It's a lot easier to control. However, all agencies would have to be willing to do that. And
Stephen.
Well, I think a couple points. Like here, it's done by the equivalent of the SHPO. So that's where that degree of control is. You don't have to get all the agencies on board, because it'd be the SHPO who's saying yes or no. And
we don't have SHPO for every project here. That doesn't.
Really?
Right.
They don't have their hands in every project, at least where I am.
Yeah. Well, part of that would be the BLM programmatic agreement, right? Mm-hmm. Where they came up with modified 106 process.
Yeah, but there's a lot of projects that don't have, aren't subject to the 106 process. So I'm talking about those
state
projects. Yeah, they're private projects, small private projects that.
Yeah.
Don't.
Here that doesn't matter, right? Like it goes to one reviewing agency, and it's that reviewing agency that oversees the archaeology within the province. And so you would have to get something like that. So like a combination of, I guess, state archaeologist and SHPO, something like that.
Right.
But the other point is, and this goes a little further back into what Heather was saying, is the whole you get situations where the developer, they've already done their project, so why finish the archaeology report? It's like if they don't finish the archaeology report, they don't get approval to do their project.
Yeah.
Right.
Because again, it's coming from the government. Like we send it to the government reviews the archaeology, and that's a tick box in the development chain. That, if that tick box does not get ticked, they don't get approval, which doesn't always mean that, a firm couldn't just go ahead and do it anyway, but that's, that is illegal.
All right. Well, on that note, let's call this segment and bring it back on the other side and finish off this discussion about the RPA. Back in a second. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show. Welcome back to episode 198 of the CRM Archaeology Podcast, and we are talking about the RPA. And I want to take it just a little bit different direction here and talk about the RPA itself and what they're doing to help themselves, because there's often waves of discussion, as we mentioned, which sparked this whole episode anyway, on particularly Facebook. Stephen, you're more plugged into Twitter. I don't know if anything much happens over there. I don't generally visit there very often, but do you guys know who the current president of the RPA is?
No.
It's a woman. Trish Hernandez?
Nope. No, she is the president-elect. So that answer will be correct on January 1st.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shit. What's his name?
Linda Stein.
Oh.
It was Christopher Dorr before her, and I knew
Christopher. Okay.
I knew Christopher Dorr because I'd seen him at a number of conferences, and Linda's got the unfortunate circumstance of not actually going to any conferences this year. Like, I'm pretty sure she was at SHA, but then of course there's no other conferences, so people don't get a chance to meet her, because typically the president will go to at least the big four, and they might send a rep to some of the smaller ones, but at least the president will go to the big four and then, get to meet people and say, hey, I'm the president, let's talk. But so I'll give her that. But, the other thing is, and then Trish Fernandez, who's going to be the president next year, I hope we can develop a decent relationship, because a long time ago, and I don't even remember why, and when I say a long time ago, I mean at least probably 6, 7, 8 years ago, back when this podcast really first started, because I was posting this podcast it was our only podcast, and I was posting it on an archaeology group on Facebook that Trish was a moderator of. And they kept telling me not to post links. Like, I didn't do it all the time. They the first time I posted a link to a podcast thinking the title would spark conversation. That's what I wanted to do. That was the whole goal. They said, hey, you can't post links in this group. And I was like, unless you're sparking conversation or creating a conversation. I was like, well, yeah, I thought I was. So, okay, no problem. So then I would accompany the post with some text that says, hey, in this episode, we talked about this. What do you guys think about this? And then her and this other guy, I don't even remember his name, just got all up in my face about just self-promotion and posting these podcasts. And I was like, I'm not the only one on the show, right? Like, this is the only CRM Archaeology podcast out there, and I'm trying to get conversation rolling with our topics that we're discussing on the show. Like, I don't make any money off this. We have no advertising. Like, what's in it for me? Literally nothing. And she blocked me. She blocked me from the group, and she blocked me from her own personal Facebook account. And now every time I see her commenting on stuff, her name is black because it's not linkable, but she can't hide it in a public group, right? So anyway, that's how I know I'm still blocked. I actually just saw that just the other day. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's fine. She probably doesn't even remember that she did that. I'm sure she holds no animosity or even remembers who the heck I am right now, which is fine. But this is our next president of the RPA. And my whole point about saying this is I'm just looking down this list of names, and the only one that I actually recognize besides Trish is Jane Baxter, who's the AAA director for the RPA. So she's the AAA, I guess, representative. I actually don't know how that works. Is she from the AAA as a representative of the RPA, or was she elected into the RPA to be a representative regarding the AAA? I'm not sure how that works. So, but anyway, I recognize her name, and I don't recognize any of the other people, which means that all these conversations and all this talk that's happening amongst the people that the RPA should be catering to as members, they're not responding. Now, I understand organizations have generally a policy of not responding and getting into it. Like, you don't want to be that organization, right? But that being said, you don't see any promotion. You don't see any discussion started by them. You don't see anything. And I'm saying this from somebody who thinks we need the RPA and thinks that the RPA is valuable. And I'm still saying that they're not doing enough to promote themselves and what they do. If people say, I don't know what the RPA does and the RPA is useless if it doesn't get me a job, then they're not doing their jobs enough to promote it. And if they're not going to do their jobs, then I don't know, what the heck is the point? I mean, is the point of their job just to go to conferences and set up a booth and give people a little pin to put on your thing because you're RPA? because they literally don't seem to do anything else. I know they're doing some other stuff behind the scenes. The whole grievance process, like you mentioned, is kind of their bread and butter. That's where most of their money goes. We've interviewed the past like 3 or 4 presidents, I think. And, but that's the thing that they always highlight is the grievance process. You can do this. I actually submitted an RPA grievance back when I was a field tech, an angry little field tech, against a supervisor that I was working for. And to be honest, I don't even know how that turned out. Like, I submitted it. Somebody called me, the grievance coordinator, got my side of the story. And then we actually left that job. So I don't even know what happened. I have no idea, which is kind of the whole point of their grievance process anyway. But anyway, I just wanted to bring up, if they're going to say that they need members and they're doing stuff, then they need to get out there and do stuff and promote themselves. And, otherwise, who knows who they are.
Yeah, I think that I've noticed this just kind of across the board with archaeology or CRM in particular. There's a big chasm between those that are in the field and the techs and those that manage. We know this. We talk about this all the time on the podcast, but specifically, they don't have their thumb on the, heartbeat of our population when it comes to techs. And I think that that's carrying over to RPA because, listen, social media is not my world, but I do watch it on purpose because I think that it's important. I mean, there's a lot of people, I can't tell you how many archaeologists, especially those that are in a managerial position, that have said, you know what, I'm off of all social media. It's like they boycotted social media. But, the thing is that because of our discipline, we can be so isolated physically and mentally, and we just stay in our own little circles and we don't have an understanding of what other people are going through. And I think maybe this is carrying over to the RPA, is that, people are not listening. It's shocking to me, actually, when I talk to my colleagues and they have no concept of the frustrations that you're hearing from techs on social media. Now, a lot of it's unwarranted. I really believe that it's a lot of just negativity. But the thing is, because of this chasm, that negativity has just bred and multiplied, and it's not good. And, people they're not talking and trying to solve and, solution-based. It's just complaining and blaming somebody other than themselves. So, as far as the RPA, the other aspect that I think kind of works against us is that we're so busy. What we do entails so many different aspects that we're all, I don't know, everybody I talk to, they're up to their eyeballs, up to their head, over their head in work. And so I can imagine that, the RP, those that are on the board for RPA, they've got enough on their plate along with just trying to do the bureaucracy of running a group like the RPA to then on top of that, try to improve things. I think maybe the structure needs to change and maybe they do need to have more paid positions. I know that there's an issue with paid positions that can create its own problems. But when you're having volunteers, there's just only so much people can do.
Yeah. Indeed. I've been a part of a few volunteer organizations, namely the Civil Air Patrol. And I'll tell you what, and we've got 90 plus members, and it's still like pulling teeth to get people to do one of the required jobs that we are overseeing. And that's like requirement from the Air Force on down. And we still can't get people to do it, let alone something like the RPA, which is essentially a construct invented by a group of people that a lot of people don't even think is doing anything. So being a volunteer, elected person to the RPA, man, I got to imagine how demoralizing sometimes must that be. You know what I mean? To think that, well, what are we actually doing here? What are their goals? And did they put out a report? I can't remember ever seeing one, but did they put out a report of like what their goals were for the year and whether or not they achieved those? And, does the membership even have an opportunity to have a say-so in that? The only thing I see from the RPA every single year is an election notice, who won the election, and then my membership dues renewal. That's literally it. And again, this is speaking from the context of somebody who thinks we need the RPA. I'm not saying the RPA is incredibly functional or even useful right now. And again, if they are useful, they need to speak up and say how they're useful. But if I don't know that they're useful and I'm a member for 10 years, you guys have been members for longer. If we don't think they're useful, then they're not doing a good enough job to sell their services, right? And to sell what they're doing for us, if anything. And if they're not doing anything for us, then like I said before, if we want it to be something, and we should, if we need to strip down the RPA and start over, that's fine. But we don't have any other body of archaeologists aside from one of the 4 major conferences, but they don't really do anything either except put on conferences and publish papers, right? They don't really have any sort of advocacy or anything like that. But ACRA might be separate, but they're not one of the big 4. You know, if we want RPA to be something, then we should just dismantle it and make it that something. It might not be what it is now, but it can be something. And if we need to start over, but just leave the letters there, leave the name there, just because of the history that it's got a well-established history, and we can go to other agencies and groups if we want to try to get licensing, if we want to try to unionize, like we talked about on the last podcast, something like that. The RPA is the longest standing non-conference organizing body for archaeologists that we have. I can't think of anything else. So let's strip it down and make it useful.
Yeah, I think one idea, just kind of off top of my head right now, would be, at these conferences. Now, again, at these conferences, maybe they get somehow, having meetings, a required meeting, but, how do you require it? Or you motivate in some other way where they have a meeting at every single one of these conferences where, they need more hands in there. It's just too much. This is a national organization and they have just too few people stepping in there. I mean, I don't envy them. My life is so busy. And I can't imagine being on that board and then on top of that, trying to be effective. It's just, there's only so much time. And that's where delegation is important. They need to maybe have more positions, need to have more committees, and they definitely need more involvement and, people putting their heads together and finding a way to make this better. And you know what? Having more people involved will make it better. And then also it will help the psyche of the RPA, and people will have buy-in because they've made it what it needs to be. It's harder to complain about something you've had a hand in.
Yeah. And I think just like enforcing other standards, like we've pretty much all come to whether it's SOI, whether you need SOI standards or not for your particular job that you're hiring for. Cause just quite frankly, some do and some don't, but we've all just kind of had a handshake agreement that says, yeah, but we need a degree and a field school. Like, you never see a job posting that doesn't say degree in a field school, right? Nobody required that, right? Nobody said, hey, all job postings, no matter where you're working or who you're working for, should have a degree in a field school. We all just kind of agreed that. And that's the way it's become. And I think if people wanted the RPA to start standing for something, to start being something, one of the things employers would have to do is really start requiring that, and just require some sort of standard. You already require a graduate degree for certain levels, and that graduate degree says, in theory, this person did this thing, right? They went to a school, they learned theoretically certain things, although not all graduate degrees are created equal, but they went through some sort of critical thinking exercise at some sort of higher institution and produced a document, right? And produced something out of that said, here's what I did, right? And again, there's different degrees of that, but that's what it means when you say you went to graduate school. When you went to your undergrad, it means you have a basic theoretical knowledge of anthropology in this country and archaeology if you're over in the UK, something like that,
right?
Because it could be history, it could be geography in some cases, but at the very least you have a basic understanding, and that's what those things mean. And I think if we start saying yes, and we also need to have RPA or RA, because this at its base level is what that means, and it's the requirements that they have. And, if you say must have 2 years of experience as a field technician, you're hiring field technicians, well, just say they must have an RA. That's it. That should cover everything that you need, right, according to what their minimum standards are. Now, whether or not they're I don't know who's reviewing that. I don't know how strict they are being with that, and if they're letting anything slide or whatever. But at the very minimum, this must be true if they have this, right? So if we just start requiring that, well, that'll inherently give it a little more teeth. I don't know.
I also think it would be much more helpful to have a tiered RPA. I've been in referee or ice hockey officiating for 30 years, and there's 4 levels. There's 5 levels in Canada, and there's 4 levels in the US. And, you have to have, there's certain requirements for each one of those levels. And then there's education that goes along with each one of those levels. And so that means, I could be a ice hockey referee, a registered ice hockey referee with USA Hockey, but that doesn't mean anything. Like, am I qualified to officiate, AAA, 18-year-old AAA hockey just because I'm a registered referee with USA Hockey? No, you really should be at least, a level 4 referee. And so right now, to have this all be one, I got my RPA, I graduated from college, I wrote a report and I gave you my thesis, and now I have an RPA. It really doesn't mean much. I really think we should have a tiered a tiered.
I don't know, Heather. That's crazy talk. It took them 35. It took them 35 years to get a second tier. So I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I figure if hockey players can figure it out, archaeologists should be able to figure it out.
I hear what you're saying too, because my first 3 or so years in archaeology, 2 at least. I'm trying to think. I'd have to look at my CV, but at least 2 to 3 years in archaeology, I did phase 3 open, like large block excavation projects. Never did a shovel test, never did a pedestrian survey, nothing. If you'd asked me as a field tech what archaeology is, it's massive, large scale excavation. That's what it is. That's what I had experience doing. Right. And it wasn't until we came out. And then after that, we got into some shovel testing, and it was just an interesting run of projects that we happened to get, my wife and I, when we were just dating at the time. And then we started doing shovel testing, and then 10,000 shovel tests later, we was like, screw this. And we moved to the West. And that's when we did our first non-shovel testing pedestrian survey out in the West. And now at this point, I've done, regardless of how you define phases, if Tom King is listening to this, you do your phase 1s, which is your shovel testings or pedestrian surveys, your phase 2s, which is your somewhat close interval, small scale excavations. I've done 1x1s, 1x2s, backhoe trenches, 50 by 50s on a 5-meter grid, and then all the way up to block excavation, just full scale. Let's dig this thing up. And so it's pretty much done kind of everything, right? And most people at this level probably have, if they've worked across the country or even in one spot consistently, you've generally done all these things. But that's not necessarily always true. Like, I've met people working here in Nevada that have only ever done pedestrian survey. Like, they've literally never done a shovel test, and they've rarely done an excavation, because if you stay in Nevada, you'll rarely do excavations, right? There's so much land that whatever project you're on, they'll just move it. Like, I've seen entire pipelines moved by 300 meters, which when you pull a pin on a string, as though you're pulling the pipeline, you're not just pulling that one pin 200 meters, you're moving 10 miles of the pipeline in order to get it to bend that way. And then you've got to resurvey a whole area. And they're willing to do that because it's cheaper than an excavation. So it's just, you're not qualified to do an excavation just because you've got 10 years of project management experience in Nevada,
Well, I don't want to scare you, but I could get even crazier. We should have separate categories for human osteology, for lithic experts.
Oh man, you're going nuts.
Because how many times do you have people who are just, I don't have a lithic analyst. Here's a book, learn it, and here's the assemblage, do it. That's not. It's and that's where we end up with shoddy work. But let's one step at a time. But just like what you said, I've recently ran into a PhD archaeologist who supposedly has been doing this for 30 years, who clearly does not understand the CEQA. phases and, how you go from, an absence presence to significance to data recovery, doesn't understand the idea, that evaluating significance, you have to truly evaluate significance. And sometimes that requires something other than that, the phase 1, 2, 3, like what Tom King says. You don't necessarily have to go in that order. Sometimes you can find out significance, in an extended phase 1. But people, just because they have that PhD or just because they have the RPA and just because they've been working for, within 30 years, they could have been working for, an agency where they never actually even put shovel to ground. Yeah. So now they have this experience, but they really don't have the experience and the knowledge that they should have in order to then shift over to CRM and actually produce a good, defensible, quality product in the end. They don't have, they just don't have the perspective or the experience in order to do that yet. And yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, a multi-tiered approach would be preferable, but again, it would take people enforcing that. So anyway, we're pretty much up on time on this. We're going to go now, and because we could keep talking about RPA forever. And again, I do think the RPA is useful. I think it can be useful. Let me put it that way. I don't necessarily think it's useful now. I think it can be useful because they've got such a potential momentum with all the people that are a part of it and all the people that like to be a part of it, that don't have a problem with it, that would be champions for them if they ask them, and just a huge potential energy that they're sitting on. They're this huge megalith at the top of a mountain, just tipping over the side, and they're either going to tip into a pit of despair or they're going to tip into success, right? And it's just like, we need to do something, because with social media and with people, pretty much anyone having a voice these days, there are a lot of naysayers out there about something like the RPA, and rightly so, as we mentioned, but there's not enough people jumping to their defense. There are people jumping to their defense on some of these posts, but the RPA itself is not jumping to their defense. And I did see one past president get in there and say something, but yeah. And anyway, I think in the end, if you want the RPA to do something, then contact your RPA representatives. If you're part of the RPA, if you're not, become part of the RPA, because anyone can do it now if you got the experience and you meet those qualifications. And it's not that much money. It's a rager at the local bar. And when you decided to buy drinks and spend your 1 days of per diem on those drinks, that's your RPA membership right there. So just don't do that one time, and then you can become an RA or an RPA. And I know nobody has any money in this field, but in the end, I think it's not that much considering what it could be, and critical mass will help it become that. So anyway,
ask your company.
Yeah, exactly.
For it too. That's a fair request.
Absolutely. So thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next time. Leave your comments on this on the RPA and what you would do if you were the RPA president. I want to know that. Where would you want to go if you were the president of the RPA right now? And then go get yourself on the ballot. All right. That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.arcpodnet.com/CRMArcPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at arcpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.